Okay, so now we want to talk about photosynthesis, and this first section is a bit of an introduction. It is clearly a very important process that photosynthetic organisms like plants do. They are able to use sunlight energy, and as we'll see, they're able to turn that into chemical energy in the form of sugars. They're able to take the water out of the ground, the carbon dioxide out of the air, and again, using that sunlight energy, make sugars, and in the process, give off oxygen, which is a very handy and useful thing for us and themselves. So photosynthesis plays a very important role in natural systems in providing the energy for those organisms at the base of the food chain, the plants basically, who are known as the autotrophs, the organisms that make their own food. They provide the food in the form of chemical energy to all the animals and other things up the food chain. These things known as heterotrophs. So the autotrophs are basically the plants, the photosynthetic organisms, and the herbivores eat the plants, and then the carnivores eat the herbivores, and energy is able to move on up the food chain, starting again with the plants. You could say that basically the energy that we're getting in the foods we eat ultimately comes from the sun. And it's the plants that harness that sunlight energy and turn it into a form of energy that we can use. Now, plants aren't the only photosynthetic organism. You also have the algae that's found in aquatic systems, and things like kelp, which is a type of algae, sort of, that's really large, grows these kelp forests. And then, of course, you have plants. And also so we've got algae and kelps, and, of course, plants. In the aquatic system, we also have these types of bacteria that are photosynthetic, and they are known as cyanobacteria. You'll find them in freshwater systems and saltwater systems, same as algae. And of course, you can also find plants in aquatic systems like the ones in our fish tank. But all of those are photosynthetic. Now, we'll just focus on plants here. So here we have, of course, the leaf. The leaf is the plant structure that is doing sometimes all or most of the photosynthesis. And here's a cutaway of the leaf. You can see you've got a layer of cells called the epidermis on the upper side and lower side of the leaf. They sort of are a protective layer, like the skin, essentially. And the epidermis secretes a material, a waxy material called the cuticle, which makes the leaf watertight. You also have veins in the leaves, and they are what bring water up through the stem and into the leaf. And then you've got all these cells in the inside known as the mesophyll cells, and they're the ones that are doing all the photosynthesis. You can see inside of them are all these chloroplasts here. And now we're looking at a chloroplast here, and this is one from an electron micrograph. And so that chloroplast, it's this membrane-bound organelle that photosynthetic organisms have, except for the cyanobacteria, they don't have one, but all the algae and plants do. And so it's got an inner and an outer membrane, and then the stroma, which is the liquid inside, and then surrounded by the stroma is the thylakoid membrane, which is all these stacks inside there. The thylakoid. All right, and the thylakoid is arranged in these sort of like coins stacked up, known as granum. And you can see the cutaway of the thylakoid membrane here, and so there's a space inside there. There are some connections between the different stacks of granum. Okay. Now we'll see later that it's on the thylakoid membrane where a very important step, what are known as the light reactions in photosynthesis is occurring. in the stroma, between the thylakoid, is where what's called the Calvin cycle is happening. And there are going to be materials, compounds moving between the thylakoid membrane and the stroma as these two parts of photosynthesis are working together. Okay. So here's how these two reactions work together. The light reactions, as you can imagine, take advantage of light energy, and they also make use of water. It's where the water in the overall photosynthetic formula comes from. C6H12O6 plus O2. So the water is used in the light reactions. Carbon dioxide is used in the Calvin cycle. And what's happening is the light reactions are generating energy-rich molecules, NADPH and ATP. We'll see the details of how that happens later. And those energy-rich molecules are used to drive the Calvin cycle, which takes in the CO2 and is able to make use of that CO2 to build up some sugars. Now, the oxygen comes out of the light reactions when the water, as we'll see, is split. The sunlight energy drives the splitting of water, which makes the oxygen available to be given off. It also makes available some hydrogen ions. And as we'll see, it's going to provide electrons for the light reactions, and we'll see what role they play. Now, after these energy-rich molecules go to the Calvin cycle and that energy is used to drive the Calvin cycle, they have lost some energy and they then head back to the light reactions to be re-energized. And so they're just constantly going back and forth between the light reactions and the Calvin cycle. All right. Now, ATP is a pretty important molecule in this process, and we'll see also in the next chapter in cellular respiration. So it should be somewhat familiar if you think of nucleic acids and nucleotides, because it's similar. It has a pentose sugar, and it has this nitrogen base called adenine. And together, when you put the pentose sugar and the adenine together, you get an adenosine molecule. Well, we also add on some phosphate groups, and when you have three of them, you have adenosine triphosphate. If you only have two, you have adenosine diphosphate, and then adenosine monophosphate with one. So we're going to see these two in particular are going to be seen a lot because we get the energized ATP and then the lower energy ADP going back to be converted back into ATP. ATP is essentially a molecule that is sometimes described as the energy currency of living things. By adding on or removing phosphate groups, you either gain or lose energy. So ATP is in a higher energy state compared to ADP. Okay, more about that later.